As we celebrate the literary works of Okot P. Bitek, that has been one of the prolific writers and critical thinker in the history of literary works in this country, Uganda, and across both in Africa and the world. Today, we want to celebrate Okot P. Bitek works by looking particularly on this book titled Lakta, which is actually 4 in English is the white teeth. And as we read and celebrate this important work of Okot P. Bitek, Lakta, we want to approach it from a methodology that we are calling genealogy. And we pick this from Michel Foucault's notion of genealogy, which means we are tracing the founding moments, the founding literary works, and the founding scholarship that helped and formed Okot P. Bitek's book, Lakta. In this presentation, I want to provide a critical analysis of Okot P. Bitek, Lakta's contribution to the African literary and cultural movement of the 1960s and 1970s. Here, I try to examine his work in relation to the broader intellectual and cultural movements of the time, exploring his commitment to the decolonization of African culture and the valorization of African cultural heritage. I try to explore how Okot P. Bitek's poetry, plays, and cultural criticism in Lakta challenges the dominant cultural narratives of the West and how that promoted an African cultural nationalism. Through a close analysis of his life and work, I try to highlight his continued relevance in contemporary African literature and cultural studies. And the main keywords that we are going to deal with here is the idea of Lakta, genealogy, post-colonial theory, critical theory, and cultural movement. By way of introduction, Okot Bitek was a Ugandan writer and cultural activist who played a significant role in the African literary and cultural movement, as we said, in the 1960s and 70s. His work, which includes poetry, plays, and cultural criticism, reflects his commitment to the decolonization of African culture and try to reimagine and restage an African cultural heritage. And so we want to see the contribution of Lakta in building this idea. Lakta is a seminal work of an African literature that has been widely recognized for its contributions to African cultural studies and oral literature. The book is a collection of Acholi poems, songs, folktales, and proverbs that offer insights into the cultural and social values of the Acholi people of Uganda. This critical theory book seeks to explore the literature and cultural significance from various theoretical perspectives, including post-colonialism, cultural studies, and African literary theory. Through a critical analysis of Lakta, I aim to provide a comprehensive understanding of Okot P. Bitek's literary and cultural legacy as well as to contextualize his work within the broader intellectual and cultural movements of the time. I want to engage with African literary and cultural movements to which Okot Pibitek was in, and try to see how Laktar seeks to reclaim African culture and identity and challenge the stereotypes and misrepresentations imposed by European colonialism. Accordingly, I examine how Laktar's book reflects the themes and concerns of this movement, such as how African culture can be reaffirmed, the critique of colonialism, and the search for a distinct African identity. Through a close reading of selected poems and songs from Laktar's book, I try to highlight Okot Pibitek's contribution to the African literary and cultural movement and the broader project of decolonization. But the context of this is, in a sense, to recall the significance of oral tradition and the preservation of actually oral literature. I situate Okot Pibitek's work within the larger tradition of African oral literature, examining the role of oral tradition in shaping African cultural identity and resisting colonial dominion or domination. Additionally, we provide a complex critical texture of the book to situate it within the broader context of post-colonial critique, examining the ways in which Laktar resisted colonial and neo-colonial hegemony. But to do this, we have to take a little bit of time to understand the background from which Okot Pibitek's book, Laktar, ensures or comes. Laktar is a seminal work of African literature that was first published in 1971. And as we said earlier on, for purposes of recollection, it's a combination of actually poems, proverbs, songs, and folk tales that offer insights into the cultural and social values of the Acholi people of Uganda. As an important work of literature, it has its own academic and scholarly genealogy that can be traced back to various intellectual and cultural movements, as well as to the works of other writers and scholars that we are going to see a little later. One of the most significant influence on Okot Pibitek's writing is the African literary and cultural movement that we've already said of the 60s and 70s. This movement was characterized by a rejection of Western cultural imperialism and a celebration of African culture, history, and traditions. Writers and scholars associated with this movement, such as Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, all sought to reclaim African culture and to challenge the stereotypes and misrepresentations that had been imposed on it by European colonialism. Okot Pibitek was then influenced by this movement, and his work can be seen as a contribution to this larger goal. Another important influence on Okot Pibitek's writing is the oral tradition of the Acholi people in northern Uganda. Okot's decision to collect and publish these works was a conscious attempt to preserve the cultural heritage of the Acholi people and to share it with a wider audience, which today I'm relaying. The work of other scholars, such as Jan van Sina, who studied and documented oral traditions in Africa, also influenced the work and the approach of this work. Okot P. Bitek's own academic and scholarly background also influenced his writing. He was educated at Makerere University in Uganda, where he studied English literature, and later at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where he earned a PhD in anthropology. This aspect of his PhD has been contested, and there's been a number of discussions. For purposes of this reading, we are not going into. What we know is he earned his PhD in anthropology. His academic training in literature and anthropology gave him the tools and the perspectives to analyze and interpret the cultural traditions and practices of the Acholi people, as well as to appreciate their literary and artistic expressions. Finally, Okot Bitek's work has influenced and been influenced by other writers and scholars who have studied and written about African oral tradition and literature. For example, the Nigerian writer and scholar Isodore Okpewo has written extensively on African oral literature and has cited Okot P. Bitek's work as an important contribution to the field. Similarly, the Ugandan scholar Susan Nalugwa Chiguli has analyzed Okot Bitek's work in the context of the larger cultural and political movements of the time. As we spoke about the background, which was particularly historical background, we wanted to look a little bit into the theoretical background, or rather the theoretical formation of Okot P. Bitek. And here we are focusing much more on the African literary and cultural movement, which already we said started around 1960s and 1970s. This movement emerged in the context of decolonization and political independence, and sought to reclaim African culture and identity and challenge the dominant cultural narratives of the West. Here, we examine the contribution of Okot P. Bitek in Lakta to this literary and cultural movement. And this work reflects his commitment to the decolonization of African culture and reaffirming the African cultural heritage. To understand this contribution, it is essential to consider the theoretical formation from which it comes from. First, we want to say that the movement was characterized by a diverse range of writers and cultural activists, including Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Wole Soyinka. But what is quite important here is that the work drew heavily not only from the African oral tradition, which saw as a vital source of African cultural heritage, but also a direct critique on the dominance of the Western tradition and the Western idea of critical thinking, critical writing. And as a result, Lakta, as a critique, challenges what we've already said, the Eurocentric cultural and literary canons that had dominated African intellectual and cultural life during the colonial period. And what Bitek decides to do is to generate and regenerate the formative literary traditions to enhance his idea. And so, Lakta, as the title of the book does say, has several reasons. is a term from his native Acholi language spoken in northern Uganda. And as it were, it translates as white teeth, or to many, it is I the poet. This title is significant because it emphasizes the importance of the individual poet and their role in shaping the cultural and intellectual traditions of a community. Additionally, the use of the Acholi language in the title reflects Okot P. Bitek's commitment to promoting not just African languages and cultures in the face of Western cultural imperialism, but create a new theoretical frame that is participated in by the African scholars and also African-based. And so, by using an Acholi term as the title of his book, Okot Bitek was asserting the value and the importance of African languages and cultural traditions, which had been marginalized and suppressed. Furthermore, the use of the term Lakta reflects Okot's belief in the power of poetry to shape and transform communities. In the introduction to the book, Okot P. Bitek writes, and I quote, "I believe that every good poem, like every good thing, must be a blessing to its people, to its generation, and to the world." And indeed, the title emphasized the central role that poetry plays in shaping a people and drawing through and from their aspirations to create a transformation in both the same community and neighborhood or country, region, and the world. In literary criticism, the term Lakta is significant because it reflects the central role of the poet in shaping and transforming cultural and intellectual traditions. It also emphasizes the individual poet and one's creative vision and highlights the unique perspective and voice that the poet brings. This perspective is shaped by the poet's personal experiences, cultural background, social context, and all is expressed in the poet's use of language, imagery, and other literary devices. And in literary criticism, Lakta is often used to highlight not just the works, but also the voice and the perspective from the community, to promote, to value, to popularize, and to make good the community's language, values, aspirations, and how they imagine the future collectively. From the background of Okot P. Bitek, let us go into how we can read Okot P. Bitek Lakta within critical traditions. Rereading Okot P. Bitek's Lakta requires engagement with a range of theoretical and mainstream literature that can help to situate his work within a broader cultural and literary context. Some key theoretical and mainstream literature to consider include post-colonial theory. And in post-colonial theory, we see a useful framework for rereading Lakta as it highlights the ways in which colonialism has impacted the cultural and literary traditions of African societies or communities. And the key post-colonial theories include Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and Gayatri Spivak. The next is African Cultural Literary Studies, which is a range of African cultural and literary studies that can also be drawn upon to reread Lakta. This includes works by scholars such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe, and Wole Soyinka. But we also have the oral tradition and folklore studies that Lakta draws heavily from to reread the work that requires the theoretical and mainstream literature on oral tradition and folklore studies. Key authors in this field include Jack Goody, Ruth Finnegan, and Alan Dundes. Post-structuralism and deconstruction. The post-structuralist and deconstructionist perspective from Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida can also be useful for rereading Lakta, as they offer alternative ways of understanding power dynamics and textual interpretation. And also from African philosophy, that the works of African philosophers such as Kwasi Wiredu, John Mbiti, Henry Odera Oruka can be drawn upon to situate Lakta within broader African philosophical perspectives. By engaging with this theoretical and mainstream literature, scholars like you and I can gain a deeper understanding of the cultural, literary, and philosophical context of Okot P. Bitek's work of Lakta and develop more new understanding, more nuanced, complex interpretations. Postcolonial theory, for example, is a useful framework for rereading Lakta, as it provides a lens through which to analyze the work in relation to the broader socio-historical and cultural context of Africa during colonial period. One way in which post-colonial theory can be applied to Lakta is through an examination of the ways in which colonialism impacted African cultural and literary traditions. Lakta, therefore, can be seen as a response to the erasure of African cultural and literary traditions. It can be seen also as a response to the erasure of African oral traditions and cultural practices that occurred during colonial period, as well as critique of Eurocentric epistemologies that were imposed on African societies and communities. Additionally, postcolonial theory can help to highlight the power dynamics that are present, as Lakta shows, and to explore the ways in which these dynamics are shaped by colonialism. For example, the use of Swahili and other African languages in the text can be seen as a form of resistance against the dominance of European languages during the colonial period. Postcolonial theory emerged in the mid-20th century as a way to critique and challenge the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. The theory draws on a range of disciplines including literary studies, history, sociology, anthropology, and cultural studies to analyze the social, political, and cultural processes that shape post-colonial communities. One of the central tenets of a post-colonial theory is the recognition of the ongoing impact of colonialism on post-colonial communities. It argues that the legacy of colonialism is not limited to the political economic structures that were put in place during colonial period, but also includes cultural, linguistic, and epistemic systems that were imposed as well. Postcolonial theory emphasizes, therefore, the importance of subaltern voices and the need to decenter dominant narratives and discourses. This is the background from which Lakta emerges. But also, Okot P. Bitek was also substantially influenced by the community of academics of the time. One of the most important influence on Bitek's work of Lakta was the anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard, who conducted extensive fieldwork in Acholi region of Uganda in 1920s and 1930s. Evans Pritchard work on Acholi culture and religion provided Okot Bitek with a deep understanding of the cultural traditions and practices of his people. Another influence on Bitek's work was the linguistic and cultural critic Ngugi wa Thiong'o, whose work on the importance of African languages and cultural traditions in literature and education resonated with Bitek's own ideas. Bitek was also influenced by the cultural critic Frantz Fanon, whose writings on the psychological impact of colonialism on African peoples informed Bitek's critique of the effects of colonialism on Acholi people. In addition, Bitek was influenced by the work of African scholars and writers such as Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Amos Tutuola, all who are grappling with the legacy of colonialism and the role of African cultural traditions in modern world. We want to focus a little bit on the relationship between Evans Pritchard's work on Acholi culture and religion and the significant influence on Okot Bitek's Lakta. Evans Pritchard research into the Acholi people and their cultural practices provided Okot with a deep understanding of his own culture and traditions, and helped to shape his own views on the importance of African cultural traditions and the role of oral literature in preserving and transmitting these traditions. In particular, Evans Pritchard's work on the Acholi concept of Lakta, a term that he earlier on used, was to refer to the collective wisdom, knowledge, and traditions of the community. And this provided Okot with a framework for his own exploration of Acholi cultural traditions using the same word, Lakta. Okot's Lakta, therefore, can be seen as a continuation of Evans Pritchard's work on Acholi culture, and an attempt to build on and expand upon his insights into the role of oral traditions in African communities. Bitek was critical of the way in which Evans Pritchard's work had been used by colonial powers to justify their rule over African societies. In this book, Lakta, Okot sought to challenge the Eurocentric assumptions that underlie much Western scholarship on African cultures, and instead emphasize the importance of understanding African cultural traditions on their own terms. In this sense, Okot's work can be seen as a response to and a critique of the colonial legacy that Evans Pritchard's work helped to perpetuate. However, there is also no written record to show a direct contact or interest of Evans Pritchard's on Okot's Lakta. However, given his deep respect for Acholi culture and oral tradition, and his own work on the concept of Lakta, it is possible that Evans Pritchard would have appreciated Okot's exploration of these themes in his book. It is worth noting, however, that Evans Pritchard's work was often criticized by African intellectuals and scholars for its focus on traditional and pre-colonial African cultures rather than on contemporary political and social issues facing African communities. In this sense, Okot's Lakta can be seen as a departure from Evans Pritchard's approach, as it merged more directly within the political and social realities of post-colonial African societies. The second is Ai Kwe Ama. Ai Kwe Ama. Ai Kwe Ama is a Ghanaian writer who gained prominence in the 60s and 70s as part of African literary and cultural movement. In his critical essay, The Two Faces of Africa, Ama Kwe engages with Okot's Lakta and critiques the work from the perspective of African-centered literary and cultural movement. Amakwe begins by stating that Bitek's Lakta is a valuable work that draws attention to the richness and complexity of African cultures. However, he criticizes Lakta for perpetuating certain stereotypes about Africa and its people. He argues that Bitek's portrayal of African cultures as timeless and unchanging is both inaccurate and harmful. According to Amakwe, Okot's romanticization of African cultures served to obscure the reality of the present-day African experience, including the ongoing struggles against colonialism and new colonialism. Amakwe criticizes Okot as well for his portrayal of an African woman, which he argues is one-dimensional and based on Western stereotypes. He concludes by emphasizing the importance of an African-centered approach to literature and culture. Overall, Amakwe's critique of Lakta can be seen as part of a broader debate within the African literary and cultural movement about the role of literature, about the role of orality in promoting transformations in African communities. Whereas Okot's work has been celebrated as built on richness and complexities of African cultures, Amakwe critiques this celebration and says it can and oftentimes obscures the ongoing struggles for liberation and equality that were taking place across the continent. As such, Amakwe attempts to reframe the conversation about African literature and culture in a way that emphasizes the importance of political engagement and social justice. The question that still remains is, how can we understand Lakta within the critical theory tradition? Rereading Okot Bitek's Lakta from a critical theory perspective would involve analyzing a text in light of the various social, political, and historical contexts that shaped its production and reception. Some key themes and concepts that a critical theory approach might focus on before we look at Lakta within the context of critical theory are power and domination, cultural hegemony, agency and resistance, language, and discourse. This would help to shed light on the ways in which Lakta engages with the critical theory tradition and how it contributes to the broader debates and discussion on liberation, which Amakwe had emphasized should go into. And the core readings in critical theory traditions are Michel Foucault and Antonin Artaud. So we want to see how, if Michel Foucault was around and alive, how would he read Lakta within the critical theory tradition? Michel Foucault was a French philosopher and a social theorist known for his contribution to the field of critical theory. In particular, Foucault's ideas about power, discourse, and the construction of knowledge may be useful in rereading Bitek's work, Lakta. One way that Foucault might reread Lakta is by focusing on the ways in which power is constructed and exercised through language and discourse. Foucault argues that power is not just exercised through overt forms of domination or coercion, but is also embedded in the very structures of language and knowledge. In the case of Lakta, Bitek may be seen as challenging dominant structures of power in literary discourse by using an African language and emphasizing the importance of diverse cultural perspectives. Foucault might also reread Lakta in terms of the construction of knowledge and the role of discourse in shaping cultural traditions. Foucault argued that knowledge is not objective or neutral, but it is shaped by the structures of power and cultural context in which it is produced. In the case of Lacta, Okot emphasizes the power of poetry and oral traditions to shape cultural discourse. And this is to be seen as a technique of challenging dominant Western literary traditions and promoting diverse cultural perspectives. Michel would see Okot Pibitek's work, Lacta, as a resistance to epistemic violence. As a philosopher and a social theorist who focused on the ways in which power operates within social institutions and structures, Foucault would see Okot's Lacta as a resistance to epistemic violence. By him successfully examining the ways in which power is exercised through language and knowledge. Here, epistemic violence refers to the ways in which dominant systems of knowledge and power can be used to exclude, marginalize, or suppress alternative forms of knowledge and ways of knowing. In the context of African literary and cultural movements, epistemic violence can be seen in the ways in which Western literary traditions have been used to marginalize and exclude African cultural practices and forms of expression. Foucault's idea about power and knowledge suggests that the ways in which we understand the world are shaped by the structures and of power and knowledge that exist within communities. By promoting alternative forms of knowledge and cultural expression, Okot is seen as challenging the dominant structures of power and knowledge that have been used to marginalize generally and specifically African cultural traditions and ways of knowing. The next critical theorist is Antonin Artaud, and this is our last part in today's reading. If we were to apply Antonin Artaud's idea to the reading of Okot's Lacta, we might see Lacta as a work that challenges the dominant modes of thinking and communication in Western culture. It involves focusing on the sensory and emotional aspects of the text and exploring how it challenges dominant Western modes of communication and representation. Antonin Artaud's work emphasized the importance of embodiment, sensory experience, and the limits of language. And he believed that conventional forms of communication and representation were insufficient for conveying the depth of human experience. Lacta similarly critiques dominant Western modes of communication and representation that seeks to create new forms of understanding and communication. One may pay attention to the sensory and emotional aspects of the text, such as its use of imagery, sound, and rhythm. One could also explore how the text challenges traditional modes of storytelling and representation, and how it attempts to create new forms of communication and understanding. Artaud's work was deeply influenced by his experiences with mental illness. And he believed that conventional forms of communication and representation were unable to convey the intensity and complexity of his own experience. To reread Lacta from this perspective, one could explore how the text challenges dominant forms of rationality and reason, and how it seeks to create new forms of understanding and knowledge that are rooted in embodied experience. In other words, as Artaud argues for a return to primal forms of communication, such as gesture, in order to reconnect with the body and unleash the power of imagination, we see a connection of disrupting conventional forms of representation and meaning making in order to access deeper levels of experience and expression. In this way, Lakta succeeds to challenge conventional forms of representation and meaning making, arguing that they are too reliant on Western rationalism and fails to capture the complex, nuanced, embodied experience of African communities. In that case, Lakta shares some similarities with the ideas of Antonin Artaud. Artaud believed in the power of language and how it could shape and control human experience. He also believed that Western culture had become too rational and that language had become too abstract, which prevented people from accessing deeper levels of experience and expression. And Artaud, therefore, believed that conventional forms of representation needed to be disrupted in order to access deeper levels of experience and expression. And as a result, both claimed a call for a reclamation of more primal forms of communication that are embodied, sensory, less reliant on rationalism, and more on community, everyday practices of languages in communicating and expression. As we conclude, we want to take a little bit time, about 5 or so minutes, to connect Michel Foucault and Antonin Artaud, how these two speak, and how they are within the context and relevance of Lakta. The rereading of Lakta by Michel Foucault and Antonin Artaud would likely differ in significant ways, as they have distinct theoretical frameworks and approaches to interpretation. Foucault's rereading of Lakta would likely focus on the ways in which power operates within language and discourse. He would be more interested in how Lakta challenges dominant Western modes of communication and representation, and how it opens up new possibilities for understanding and experiencing the world. Foucault might also be interested in how Okot's critique of Western rationalism could be applied more broadly to other domains of knowledge and power. And yet, Antonin Artaud's rereading, on the other hand, would likely be more focused on the sensory and embodied aspect of language and communication. He would be interested in how Lakta disrupts conventional forms of representation and meaning making, and how it creates new possibilities for accessing deeper levels of experience and expression. Artaud might also be interested in the performative aspects of Lakta, and how it could be used as a model for creating new, more embodied forms of art and expression. It is, of course, difficult to say what exactly Antonin Artaud and Michel Foucault would appreciate in Lakta, as they have different theoretical frameworks and approaches to interpretation. Antonin Artaud was a French playwright and a theater director who advocated for a new form of theater that would engage the audience, senses, and emotions, rather than just intellect. His work was deeply influenced by his experiences with mental health, and he believed that conventional forms of communication and representation were insufficient for conveying the depth of human experience. Michel Foucault, on the other hand, was a French philosopher and social theorist who focused more on the ways in which power operates within language and discourse. He believed that language is always produced within specific social historical context, and those dominant forms of knowledge and power work to marginalize and exclude alternative ways of knowing and being. What is interesting, Laktar is similarly and connects pretty much with Michel Foucault and Antonin Artaud's core works. In conclusion, the act of rereading oral tradition in Okot's Laktar can be seen as a form of resistance against dominant Western cultural and literary traditions, which have historically marginalized African forms of expression. However, it is important to note that this act of rereading is not necessarily utopian. While rereading oral tradition in Laktar may provide a way to reclaim and preserve African cultural heritage, it is not a panacea for all the challenges faced by African communities. Okot himself recognized the complexities of African cultural and political contexts, and his works often address the challenges faced by African communities in the post-colonial era. Moreover, the act of rereading oral tradition also raises questions about the power dynamics involved in the process of interpretation and representation. Okot's rereading of oral tradition in Laktar also reflects his own cultural and political perspectives, which may not necessarily be representative of all members of the Acholi community or of African societies more broadly. Therefore, it is important to approach Laktar with a critical lens as well and recognize the limitations both in Laktar and the individual interpretation by Okot. Thank you.